And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
And welcome to Mob Talk Radio. I am your host, Jeff Canarsie. It has been 2 weeks. I did not mean to take a day, as much time off as I did, but obviously Christmas was coming, so I was going to take a day or two off with that. But there was something that happened to me just prior to Christmas that was pretty crazy. And I'm going to talk about that. And the reason why I want to talk about that before we get to Dutch Schultz is because there's a lot of rumors, a lot of innuendo, a lot of gossip being spread. I've seen it all over social media. I haven't addressed it really at all, with the exception of saying a couple things here and there about it. But some of the things that are being said are just absolutely fucking ridiculous. So I need to kind of come out and talk about that. But the first thing I want to touch on is this guy named Fontaine Gambino. Now, if you don't know who this guy is, first of all, he's a nobody. He has repeatedly sent threats to me and said all kinds of crazy stuff. He's a connected guy and he could make money from me, and then it turns into this, you're a rat bastard. But yet he's on every single John Gotti page that's in fucking existence on Facebook. Now, let me tell you who this guy really is. Fontaine Gambino is not his real name. His real name is Leland Jones. And he's an African-American guy pretending to be a white Italian guy, and he's scamming people out of money on Facebook. I've seen a lot of messages from a lot of people. He's a pretender. He's a nobody. So if you're friends with this guy, know who you're dealing with. His real name is Leland Jones. He's from New Jersey. He's a scam artist. He's taking money from people. Don't believe people like this. There's 1,000 of them on Facebook. I have messages I could put out of threats he sent me. He's a fucking nobody. He's a zero. He's another one of these wannabes that tells everybody he's on Team Gotti, whatever that is. And the thing that is most ironic about this is he's also friends with a lot of rats too. And anytime you see these guys that are friends with all the rats and then they're like on Team Gotti, it's really not the case. They're playing a game like a lot of these guys do. But he's really a nobody at the end of the day. So if you're friends with this guy, just know who he is. He scammed a lot of people out of a lot of money, made a lot of stupid threats. He's even posted pictures of himself at these particular John Gotti Jr. functions, such as a movie stuff, John Travolta, et cetera, et cetera. None of it's true. It's not real. They're fake pictures. And he's borrowing money under the guise of Team Gotti needs money. Well, I don't really think that they need money. I don't think that that's what an issue is. I certainly don't think that John Gotti Jr. is going to come out and ask for money from people on the internet. So sort of be conscious and aware that if it looks like bullshit, smells like bullshit, it's going to be bullshit. So I feel bad for the people that got scammed out of money, but just be smart. And what people should do, if they have any questions, is go to Shadow of My Father page, talk to Angel Gotti. If you have any questions, talk to her. Don't take these people's word as gospel, because a lot of them are full of shit, and they're just punks, and they're cowards, and they're scam artists, and that's what they're going to do. And unfortunately, people get taken advantage of. So if you're friends with this guy, Fontaine Gambino, his real name is Leland Jones. He's from Plainfield, New Jersey. And he's a real scumbag. So just make sure you stay away from people like that, because there's so many of them that are like that. So all that being said, so why is it that I took time off? If you listen to social media, I was involved in a shooting. Now, how that went from me maybe possibly witnessing a shooting to actually being in a full-fledged shooting and firing a weapon is beyond me. I don't understand how social media can take one thing and flip it on another. But I know the people that are probably behind that. It's the same people that are behind everything that they say. They want to spin it. There are certain people, and I'm not going to get into names, but there's a certain someone anyway that I'm going to say, or certain, maybe 2 or 3 of them. There's 3 of them that I can think of that would love for me to be involved in some kind of shooting. They would love to spin it in their direction to say, see, he's gangster, he's dealing drugs, he's doing crazy stuff, see, he's not just some radio show host. They would love to tell you that. But the reality is none of that's true. I know a lot of different people from all walks of life. I'm not going to sit here and say that I am like the most nicest guy in the world, and that everybody I know and everybody I've ever talked to my whole life is straight and narrow, because that would be lying to you. I got a lot of friends in different walks of life. Some are troublemakers, some aren't. But the reality is that I was not involved in a shooting. Specifically, what happened sort of was this. And the thing that does piss me off about this is that when someone is murdered in front of you, that comes with a whole lot of baggage. It comes with a whole lot of PTSD type of stuff. And what I find amazing is that I've been around in my life things that are good and things that are bad. What I'm not going to do is sort of get into like the horrible things I've seen in my life, because nobody wants to fucking hear that. But the just sheer amount of disrespect, the sheer amount of, oh, he was doing this, he was doing the innuendo and the gossip, it's just beyond fucking ridiculous to me. A 19-year-old boy was killed. Okay, that's the reality. And I don't care what kind of walk of life you come from. There's a street saying, live by the gun, die by the gun, and that's very true in like a lot of instances. But the thing is that this is a human being, and regardless of what this person may or may not have done in his life, he didn't deserve that. Not how it went down. And so this is what happened. I was in Brooklyn, and I was standing outside of a building, and I was talking to somebody. Normal morning, nothing seemed off kilter. You know, where I was standing is not typically where I would have stood to talk to this person. Usually, I stand a couple 100 feet away from where I was, just to have a little privacy, having a conversation in Brooklyn. And so we're in mid-conversation, and I sort of look to my right. I see people. I don't want to get into too many details, but I see people coming down the street. At first glance, I don't really notice nothing. It's just people walking up and down the street. People do this all the time in Brooklyn. It's nothing new. But then I noticed something a little strange, and that was a mask over a face. And it wasn't cold that day, and I knew immediately something just didn't seem right. And what I actually did as a result is I moved about 5 feet to my left. Thank God I did that. Because what happened was there was a kid coming down the street on a bicycle, and he was heading to west. And effectively what happened was that the people that I saw prior to this had cut between cars and sort of put themselves sort of in a position to shoot this kid. And that's exactly what happened. They shot him at point-blank range twice. He fell off his bike, which was about, realistically, 20 feet from where I was standing. All right? First shot goes off, you think it's a backfire. Second shot goes off, you're like, uh-oh, this is a problem. And your brain freezes. Which way am I going to go? Where's it totally coming from? Because my back was turned to them at this point. I had moved 5 feet and turned my back. As I turned back around, I sort of inadvertently moved to the right, and this kid that was shot is now coming right towards me. Obviously, he had been shot twice. Once in the upper arm area towards his chest, and the other in his stomach. And so, like I said, I went to my right a little bit. I turned, I looked, this kid's running at me, screaming for help. What are you going to do in a situation like that? The problem is that right behind him are people. And they're not shouting. They're not yelling. They're aiming a gun at my fucking head from about 7 or 8 feet. And this kid's coming at me. I see the people. I see a guy with a gun. I start moving immediately towards my left. And thank God I did. Because this motherfucker, because that's what this guy was, fired 2 more rounds. And where I was standing just literally milliseconds before, I'm watching brick fly off the building where my head was. I don't know if the kid couldn't aim. I really don't give a fuck. That's not the point. But where my head was, and for anybody who wants to call me bullshit on this, I'll give you directions to where this happened, and I'll show you. I'll show you. You don't want to believe me. So as I look to my right, I'm seeing fire coming from the gun. I'm hearing the gun go off. And ping! Right where my head was, 2 seconds, a millisecond earlier, I see a chunk of brick going flying off the fucking bricks in the building. I'm seeing bullets ricochet off the fucking building. So I quickly run around to the left and dip in an alley. The kid that gets hit runs past me, falls down on some stairs. And the people that were involved in creating the mayhem took off in whatever direction that they took off in. I paused for a second, trying to sort of get my mind together. You know, that's not a good feeling. That's not a good situation to be in. You know, I'm in an alleyway. And I come back around, and I look to my left, and this 19-year-old kid that gets shot twice is laying on the steps dying in front of me. The only thing that I could do, because at this point 1 million people are coming over, they all called 911. I'll wait for the police and rescue and all this shit. I did the only thing I could do, and I held this kid's hand. All right. And I watched the light go out of his eyes. I watched the light go out of his eyes. A 19-year-old kid. It doesn't matter to me what walk of life he came from. Doesn't matter to me, black, white, Chinese, whatever, Hispanic. Doesn't matter to me. Because 3 days before Christmas, this 19-year-old child got shot and killed right in front of me. So that's why... wow, it's tough. So that's why I took a lot of time off. I needed to just calm the fuck down. I needed to just get myself on my feet a little bit. This wasn't easy. I've said this before, and I don't mean this to be cruel. I don't mean this to be unemotional. I don't mean this to be like, haha, funny, because it's not a funny thing. It's disgusting. But someone dying in front of me isn't really the problem. I've been around long enough in my life where my father died in front of me. Other people have. Just natural causes and stuff. And I've seen enough of that in my lifetime to reconcile that this is what happens when bad things happen. But holding somebody's hand when they're a kid and they're just looking at you helpless and there's nothing you can do, except count the seconds away till their eyes go, and that's it. That was bad enough. But to me, it was more about what I just went through. That was the issue that I had with it. Because I'll be honest with you, I don't like any motherfucker shooting a gun at me. That's just not... that's not good for me. That's not good for anybody. I think anybody that's involved in something like that, it's not a healthy thing. And I'm not going to make my anti-gun speech. I'm not going to do that. Listen, you play games in the street. This is what happened. I'm not justifying what happened to this kid at all. I can't justify that. Not when this kid was laying there and the last words he ever fucking spoke looking at me, someone he didn't even fucking know, was, please God, no, help me. And all I could do was hold his hand and scream, you just keep fucking breathing. Nothing I could do. As the cops arrived, they just, got there and did what they do. Ambulance arrives and it's too late. It's too late. So I did everything I could do. There's nothing you could do at that point. So that's what happened. So for some reason, my attorney... not for some reason, but my attorney went on social media to try to protect me in this, because we knew that word would get out and this would just kind of create some sort of fucking soap opera of mass proportions. Because this is what happens on social media. And sure enough, within 45 minutes to an hour of that, The phone starts ringing, people start hearing what's going on, and everybody jumps to conclusions. Oh, Jeff got shot at by some mafia people. Get the fuck out of here. That's not what happened. It coincides with a bunch of funny things, but that's besides the point. But nobody shot at me on the streets from that way of life. This was just me at the wrong place at the wrong time. It just, the way shit worked out. I've played it out a million times in my brain since this happened of, wow, if I hadn't have missed this train going here, I wouldn't have been there. And if I had gone to this bodega to get this instead of that, boy, that wouldn't have happened. But at the end of the day, had I not moved, I'd have been killed. Simple as that. It has a way of changing your perspective on things, but is it going to change the way that I attack rats? Absolutely fucking not. For anybody to kill somebody in broad daylight before lunchtime, they're going to kill somebody. That's a hit. That's the way it goes down. This wasn't just a, fuck you, I'm going to throw a couple bullets your way. This is the way these things happen. There was no intention not to kill this child. Full intent to kill him. That's the way it goes down, right? But the end result is, no, I wasn't involved in the shooting. I didn't fire a weapon. I didn't fucking, get into some goddamn Godfather fucking shootout. Get real. None of that happened. But that's the reality of today's youth. That's a lot of what happens with kids. They have a tendency of shooting first and ask questions later. And that's just the reality of a lot of different places. And it's unfortunate that somebody had to die. It's really unfortunate I had to be fucking standing there when it happened. Just the amount of nightmares from that. Hasn't been easy for me. So, that's why I took time off. I apologize for anybody that, thought I was dicking around and not trying to do the shows and stuff like that. But when something like that happens in front of you, you need some time away. You need to kind of reevaluate things, like which neighborhoods you're going into. And it's broad daylight. Nothing much you can do at 11 o'clock in the morning or whatever. So that's what happened. If you hear any other different story, don't believe it. Because there's a lot of haters out there and a lot of people. There were even some that made nasty comments that it's too bad I wasn't killed. So that ought to tell you the type of people I deal with. I thank God that nothing happened to me. I got 9 lives, knock on wood, still going, and I'm not going to stop. I'm not afraid of these people, but it has a way of sort of changing your narrative. But my narrative won't change on this show. I will still attack rats. I will still say what I got to say. I'm not going to back down from nobody. They don't scare me. They never have. But this was a totally unrelated, isolated incident. God willing, I hope it was fucking isolated. I don't need no more of this in my life. But that's what happened. And so you heard it from me. A lot of people were against me even talking about this. But I'm going to, because I think that for me to lie to anybody or for me to not tell you what happened is bullshit. And I always come with it. I always tell you the truth. And that's the way it's going to keep going. That's why a lot of people don't like me. They don't like the truth. They don't like anybody just... First of all, apparently I'm not allowed to have a fucking opinion anyway. But for me to be right or to tell the truth is even a bigger problem. So I'm just going to keep doing what I do. And I'm sure that there's going to be backlash on this, saying I'm crying, I'm moaning, oh, I can't handle. Somehow this is going to make me weak. I'm not a weak individual. I think you can ask anybody that particularly knows me personally. I'm definitely not a weak individual. I'm pretty tough. I'm tough as they come. But even the toughest people at times see something like that. It has a way of fucking with you a little bit. And that's exactly what happened. So we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about Dutch Schultz. Stay tuned. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are talking about Dutch Schultz today, and next week we'll probably go back and do a Q&A and some other things. So let's get started with Dutch Schultz. He was born Arthur Simon Flegenheimer in 1902 in New York City, precisely the Bronx. Sort of the early events of Schultz's life sort of kind of molded him and who he actually ended up becoming. His father, Herman Flegenheimer, actually abandoned the family when he was a young kid, and him leaving ultimately left a really deep scar in Dutch Schultz. As a result, Dutch Schultz would end up dropping out of school in the 8th grade to go to work to help support his family. And it was one of those things where he refused to acknowledge that his father, in fact, abandoned the family. It was a subject that he was not really willing to talk about, but it's also one of those things that ended up kind of molding Dutch Schultz into who he became. From 1916 to 1919, he worked as a feeder and a pressman for the Clark Loose Leaf Company, Caxton Press, Amex, and Schultz Trucking Company in the Bronx, which was no relation to him. He then ends up going to work at a neighborhood nightclub owned by an associate of the mafia, and he sort of begins robbing crap games and making money wherever he can before he ends up turning to breaking and entering as a way to profit. He ends up getting pinched for breaking and entering and gets sent to Blackwell's Island, which is now Roosevelt Island. And by all accounts, he doesn't really do very well in prison. He can't really stay out of trouble, continues to get, what they call shots, which is write-ups and stuff like that. He also strangled another inmate, but it couldn't be proven. And so what they end up doing is they throw their hands up in the air and say, look, we can't do anything with this guy. We need to send him somewhere else. And they end up sending him to a work farm in West Hampton, New York. And soon after, he ends up escaping, but he's captured 2 months later. And they ended up adding a couple of months to his sentence. And then in 1920, he would be paroled. After prison, he would go back to work for Schultz Trucking and begins associating with criminals. He had had enough of the straight life, and it was time to make as much money as possible. Also, right about this time, Prohibition sort of begins, and Schultz Trucking specifically ends up getting into the smuggling liquor and beer from New York City to Canada. That was where a lot of the liquor was coming through Canada, and Schultz Trucking I'm trying to think, off the hand or off the arm, starts importing and exporting, mainly importing liquor and beer from Canada all throughout New York. And so Schultz begins to get in that. But ultimately, he decides that he's probably not making as much of a profit as he should be, and he ends up going to work for Schultz Trucking's Italian competitor. In 1928, Joey No opens the Hub Social Club and hires Dutch Schultz as a bouncer. Schultz ends up sort of serving a purpose to No only because his reputation was that of just being absolutely brutal with people. He didn't fuck around. He would torture people. He had no problem getting his hands dirty whatsoever. So No sort of recognizes that Schultz's penchant for violence is pretty insane, and he says, you know what, you're a good guy, I can trust you, you get shit done, so I'm going to make you a partner. And they eventually end up opening 2 more clubs in 2 different locations. But to offset the costs of illegal booze, what Dutch Schultz says and what he comes to an agreement with Joey No is that we should just buy our own trucks. I mean, here we are using other people's trucks. We're paying a huge profit to these people. So maybe we should just sort of, get into our own trucks. And that's what they end up doing. And so to offset the cost of using other people's trucks, they buy their own trucks. Their main illegal liquor and beer contact was a guy named Frankie Dunn, who was a Jersey City brewery owner. So that became sort of a confluence of a business partnership that they had, for the most part, somebody they could go to who could distribute the booze. But the other problem that Dutch Schultz realizes immediately is that they're going to need protection. Here they are. They buy their own trucks. They got a partnership with Frankie Dunn, who's got the Jersey City Brewery. But Dutch Schultz, rather than go out and hire other guys to protect the trucks, he would end up riding shotgun next to the driver to ensure the deliveries got made, which takes some fucking balls, let me tell you. So he starts to have some issues, and the first issue is when the Rock brothers, who controlled the Bronx, refused to buy from No and Schultz. Schultz wanted to distribute to the Bronx, to Manhattan. They wanted to be the main supplier of booze at that point, and they run into the problem with the Rock brothers. The Rock brothers, one wanted to give in, the other didn't, and that sort of created a big issue. The Rock brothers essentially looked at No and Schultz as sort of wannabes. They didn't take them very seriously. But eventually, under pressure, the older brother, John Rock, said, fuck it. We'll buy from you guys, not a problem. But the younger brother, Joe Rock, absolutely refused. So you have one brother that's saying, yeah, we'll buy from you, no problem. The other brother saying, fuck off. And so as a result of that, No and Schultz decide to take matters into their own hands, and eventually they end up kidnapping Joe Rock, who's the one that absolutely refused to buy from them. They ended up beating him relentlessly. They hung him up by his thumbs from a meat hook, and then, this is kind of gross, but they wrapped gauze bandages smeared with discharge from a gonorrhea infection over his eyes. They demanded $35,000, and it was actually paid by his brother John, and they ended up releasing Joe, but Joe sadly would go blind from the infection, and that pretty much put Schultz and No on the map. At that point, they were pretty well feared, and they ended up expanding operations all over the Bronx. Schultz would end up becoming incredibly wealthy during Prohibition. They had a lot of the boroughs locked down. Everything was going fairly smooth. And as Schultz and No expanded, they became the only non-Italians able to rival those who would become the heads of the Mafia's 5 families. They began to expand into Manhattan's Upper West Side and into Washington Heights, Yorkville, and in Harlem. And they would end up eventually moving the headquarters to East 149th Street in Manhattan, which would create a war with Jacklegs Diamond. On October 16th, 1928, No ends up getting killed outside the Chateau Madrid on 54th Street. Even though No didn't die initially, he would end up dying on November 21st. And as a result, Dutch Schultz was absolutely irate because he believed that Jacklegs Diamond was responsible for that. And I think by all accounts, that's probably very, very accurate. Like I said, I don't have proof here sitting in front of me, but I think it makes sense. They were encroaching on other people's territory. Jacklegs Diamond didn't want them in the area. And to kill a snake, you got to cut its head off. And I think that the one thing that Jacklegs Diamond specifically didn't recognize was that of the two between No and Schultz, Schultz was the tough guy. He was the fucking gangster. And by killing No, he ends up infuriating Dutch Schultz. And Dutch Schultz was not going to be one to take that shit. So what ends up happening is a few weeks later, Arnold Rothstein ends up being found dead near a servant's entrance to the Park Central Hotel. There's a lot of conflicting reports that George McManus killed Rothstein over a gambling debt, but a lot of people in those circles and outside circles believe that Schultz killed him in retaliation for No. Now, here's the thing. By many accounts, No was killed by Jacklegs Diamond for encroaching on territory, and then rumor has it that Schultz effectively killed Arnold Rothstein in retaliation. Now, I have an opinion about this, and it's changed a little bit because a few weeks ago, I think I covered Arnold Rothstein to some extent in another issue. But I really do believe at this point that probably the reality is that McManus killed Rothstein. And the reason why I say that is not because Dutch Schultz wouldn't have killed Rothstein. I think that Dutch Schultz probably would have been a guy to do something like that. But the Rothstein problem went back because he was being accused of cheating. He owed a lot of people gambling money and wasn't paying. And a lot of people wanted his rackets, so it would make more sense at the end of the day for maybe Jack Legs Diamond to sort of get together with McManus and have that done. But like I said, either way you turn this, left or right, up or down, I don't think anybody's really going to know exactly who did that. But I think, just factually, I think McManus was probably the one that had it done. That's what a lot of people seem to think, and that's what a lot of the facts and evidence sort of suggests. As much as I would love to give that to Schultz, I just don't think he did it. However, not long after Rothstein was killed, McManus calls Schultz's attorney, whose name was Dixie Davis. And after the call, Bo Weinberg picked up McManus and drove him away from the murder scene. McManus was later cleared of any wrongdoing. So, like I said, this sort of information and this sort of evidence that McManus sort of has a loose affiliation with Schultz, at least through his attorney, Dixie Davis, sort of makes it tongue-in-cheek that maybe Schultz did have something to do with it, especially when Bo Weinberg ends up picking up McManus and sort of like sneaks him away from the murder scene. So you can draw your own conclusions there. I think that the reality is that Dixie Davis was a very, very, very skilled attorney. And so I think that anybody trying to make the correlation that somehow McManus and Dutch Schultz had this relationship going on outside the scenes isn't hard to believe that they knew each other and were friendly. I just think that Dixie Davis was the attorney to have in those days. And I think just the fact that Bo Weinberg picked him up, I mean, that's what gangsters do. They help one another. So, like I said, there's no clear-cut evidence or answer to really who was responsible for that. I still think McManus had something to do with it. I think he's the one that did it. He had the most to gain. I think Jack Legs Diamond had the most to gain from that because I think looking at the profile of who Dutch Schultz was at his fucking core, Dutch Schultz, I don't know. I just think that Dutch Schultz would take it to the fucking man rather than, like, go in a roundabout way and retaliate. I think if Dutch Schultz is going to retaliate, he's going to kill Jack Legs Diamond. I don't think he's going to fuck around with Arnold Rothstein. And the reason why is because Rothstein was very important to the mafia, and I don't think Dutch Schultz was going to want all them kind of problems. And that's why it leads me to believe that McManus was probably the one that was behind that versus Dutch Schultz. I think that Dutch Schultz is one of those guys that addresses the motherfucker that did it, and he just leaves it at that. Then in October of 1929, Legs Diamond and his mistress were eating at the Hotel Monticello. Gunmen end up breaking down the door, and they spray the entire room with machine guns. Jack Legs Diamond would survive, but he ends up seeing it for what it is and takes off out of New York City and heads to Europe. While he's gone, his crew that surrounded him was effectively forced to move outside the city. And when Jack Legs Diamond ends up coming back from Europe, he sort of transfers his power base and moves into upstate New York, specifically the Albany area. And there would be 5 more attempts on his life before he's end up being killed by the Irish Mafia in 1931. And you had better believe that Dutch Schultz likely had a lot more to do with Jack Legs Diamond being killed at the end of the day. I could go into the whole Irish Mafia war between Jack Legs Diamond and the Irish mob, but I'd rather not do that. But I think it's safe to say that the 5 attempts on his life were from multiple people, and probably including Dutch Schultz. One of the things that Dutch Schultz did different from anybody else, sort of that was related to what he did or counterparts, whatever you want to call it, was that he paid the guys that worked for him a flat salary versus a percentage from any of the rackets or operations. So what the mob typically does is you get a percentage. If you rob a bank, you're going to take your 30%, and the 70% goes up to your capo and then up to the boss. So a lot of guys that are taking cuts from smuggling to narcotics trafficking to whatever it is they do, they usually typically in the mob take a percentage of that. But what Dutch Schultz was able to do was to give these guys a flat rate every week, regardless of what they were doing. Now, we can argue about whether or not that's more profitable or not. I think in many ways that hinders guys because, let's say guys are making $1,000 a week. Yeah, that's guaranteed money. Especially in those days, that's an awful lot of money. But when you start getting into like the bootlegging and stuff like that, one shipment making, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, these guys are ending up losing more money in the long run. So from my opinion, I would rather take a percentage of rackets or a percentage of a heist than say a flat rate of $1,000 a week. Granted, $1,000 a week is guaranteed money or what have you, but that's going to end up becoming a problem for Dutch Schultz in the end. In 1930, Vincent Mad Dog Cole, who was an enforcer, decided that Dutch Schultz was a bit greedy. Vincent Cole was working for Dutch Schultz, and he sort of saw the writing on the wall about taking money, say per diem, versus a percentage of the rackets. And he starts to look at Dutch Schultz as if he's getting a little too greedy, a little too rich for his own good. And he ends up deciding he's going to discuss the matter with Schultz. And he goes to Schultz and he demands to be a full partner. And Dutch Schultz says, go fuck yourself. Not going to happen. As a result, Vincent Mad Dog Cole would end up leaving the organization. He would form his own crew. And the ultimate goal that he had at that point was taking over every single one of Schultz's rackets and actually killing Schultz. Mad Dog Cole realized very quickly that he was doing a lot of the dirty work, a lot of the murder, and Dutch Schultz was getting rich and not wanting to spread the wealth. We can sort of make a transitional sort of statement to that to, like, say, Paul Castellano. And Mad Dog Cole's just not going to take it. And what ends up happening as a result, there's a small war that sort of begins, and Vincent's brother Pete ends up getting killed. And how Vincent gets the nickname Mad Dog was from the newspapers. And what ends up happening was there was a drive-by which Cole was involved in, and he ended up killing a small child during the botched drive-by shooting, and the newspapers pretty much claimed the only person that would do that is a Mad Dog, and that's kind of where he gets the nickname or the moniker from. In February 1932, Dutch Schultz ends up luring Mad Dog Cole into a trap. Schultz had it. Cole needed to go. He was creating a problem. He was killing a lot of people. And I think Dutch Schultz realized that, considering that the public wanted Cole's head on a platter for killing an innocent child, I think he probably banked on the fact that if he killed him, not too many people were going to cry about it. So he ends up luring Cole into a trap. While Cole was talking in a phone booth outside of a drugstore, gunmen busted in and sprayed him with machine gun fire. The shooters were Fats McCarthy and the Weinberg brothers, and that pretty much ended Cole's life. And as Prohibition ends, Dutch Schultz sort of needs different income. He had made a lot of his money from trucking and bootlegging, but as Prohibition lifts and booze goes back to being the regular thing, Schultz realizes he's got to find a different way to make some money. And so effectively what he does is he gets together with Otto Adababa. That's such a fucked up name to have. But he gets together with Otto Adababa Berman, and he effectively was running the Harlem numbers racket. So they get together, and now all of a sudden Schultz is involved in the numbers game. Berman was an accountant. He was a math genius who pretty much what he did was he allowed Schultz to fix the market. Berman could quickly calculate the minimum amount of money Schultz needed to bet at the track at the last minute in order to alter the odds. It was all about altering the odds so that Schultz could continue to win. It ensured that Schultz always controlled which numbers won. So in fact, it becomes like a foolproof plan. He's affecting the outcome, and it guarantees him a large number of losers, which makes ultimately Schultz highly profitable in this area, and he was ending up making millions of dollars a month for Dutch Schultz, and as a sort of a reward for fixing the numbers racket and making it easier for Schultz to collect money, Schultz was paying him $10,000 a week. And now keep in mind, this is the 30s, so that is an awful lot of money for that time period. Then Schultz ultimately sort of begins extorting New York restaurant owners and workers. Schultz would merge all the local unions under the Metropolitan Restaurant and Cafeteria Owners Association. And that effectively brings him a lot of money because now he's sort of controlling the unions. And this was a little bit before the Italian mafia ends up taking over the unions. So in a lot of ways, Dutch Schultz was sort of a pioneer in the fact that not that the Italian mafia hadn't run unions yet, but Dutch Schultz really had a grip on how to make income and how to control the unions. If he controls the union, he controls work. If he controls the work, he can extort every single fucking business that he could possibly get his hands on. And the guy that would sort of oversee that operation was a guy named Jules Modeleski. And he was sort of the point man in that. He was the go-to guy that went to the business owners and just said, listen, you're going to give up this money or this is what's going to happen. Also around this time, Dutch Schultz begins to have another problem. And that problem would be he gets indicted for tax evasion. His trial would begin, and as the trial sort of begins, Dutch Schultz starts to think that Jules is skimming off the profits. And Dutch Schultz would be right. Schultz essentially had looked at the books, and he noticed that there was a $70,000 disparity in the books. And that's going to be an issue. March 2nd, 1935, Schultz ends up inviting Jules to a meeting at the Harmony Hotel in upstate New York. And at this meeting, which Bo Weinberg and Dixie Davis were present, his attorney and his hitman, Jules effectively talked a lot of shit to Dutch Schultz's face and sort of denies the accusation. So his attorney's there. Bo Weinberg, who is his hitman, is there, and Jules, rather than just either admit his complicity in it, just talks shit, tells Dutch Schultz he's a fucking nobody, he's out of his mind, he would never do this, the guy drinks too much, just all sorts of bullshit. And eventually, Schultz sort of gets tired of the act and ends up punching Jules in the face. And at that point, Jules gets a little scared. Because he knows who Dutch Schultz is, and he knows that Schultz will kill him without even reason. He doesn't need a reason. He'll do it. And what he ends up doing is Jules admits to stealing $20,000, which he said he would have been entitled to either way as payment. As a result of that admission, Schultz pulled out a gun, stuck it in Jules' mouth, and blew his fucking head off in front of his attorney and in front of his hitman. His body would be found on a snowbank with over a dozen stab wounds in his body. When Dixie Davis, his attorney, was asked, when he asked Schultz how the stab wounds got there, Dutch Schultz replied, "I cut his fucking heart out." So as you can see, Dutch Schultz was not about to put up with any bullshit from anybody. Guy stole money from him, he's got to go. Schultz's tax case pretty much keeps going along, and U.S. Attorney Thomas Dewey was intent on convicting Schultz. Schultz had sort of become public enemy number one for Thomas Dewey, and Schultz would end up being convicted, but it would be overturned. Schultz's attorney convinced the judge that his client couldn't get a fair trial in New York City. Everybody knew who he was, so the attorney asked the judge to transfer the case to another county where Dutch Schultz was less known, and the judge agrees, and they end up moving it to the town of Malone, which is in, rural upstate New York. So Schultz realizes he's in trouble. It's going to be hard to beat this tax case, so he has an idea. If I can go to Malone and sort of introduce myself as a nice guy, do some charitable work, maybe I can buy the jury off. And that was his thinking. And that's exactly what he does. He begins to introduce himself to the townsfolk as a smart, misunderstood guy. He donated cash to failing businesses, would go to the hospital, give toys to sick children, which was ended up being successful. In the summer of 1935, Schultz was acquitted of all wrongdoing. But there's another problem, and that other problem is he infuriates Fiorello LaGuardia, because at the time, Fiorello LaGuardia was the mayor of New York City and fucking hated Dutch Schultz. He wanted the mafia out of New York. He wanted Dutch Schultz the fuck out of there. So what LaGuardia does is he issues an order that if Schultz comes near New York City, he is to be arrested on sight. And as a result of that, Schultz says, okay, fuck you, I'll get out of New York, and I'll make my base of operations in Newark, New Jersey. I'll be across the water. I can still control my rackets. Go fuck yourself. But what ends up happening, though, is that Dutch Schultz ends up spending a ton of money, not only moving his base of operations, but now he can't directly oversee things in New York, and he's spending all this money fighting the tax evasion case. And the fact that he's like just, the money is just bleeding out of him and not enough is coming in, he has to do something to conserve himself. And what he ends up doing is he ends up cutting back on what he's paying his crew every week. He reduced pay from 50% to 10% for the runners and 5% to the controllers. And this has an effect. And the effect that it has was the guys that work for him became irate and essentially began to threaten to kill him. These guys went from making 50% to 10% to 5%, and that was absolutely just, they're not going to deal with that. So they tell Schultz they're going to fucking kill him. And then his men or crew effectively go on strike and just refuse to work in general. And Schultz begins to lose a lot of territory, and he begins to lose a massive amount of money. Schultz would end up a couple of months later relenting and saying, I'm sorry, let's go back to the way that things were, I'll pay you. But the damage was already done, and the guys that worked for him no longer trusted him and would rather see him dead. And one of the things that also happens as a result of this is Bo Weinberg, who was his go-to guy to kill people, was concerned that the money going to the Schultz Defense Fund would absolutely destroy business. All the rackets they had, everything that they needed to pay for to continue the operations going, it was being bled out. Not only is the crew unhappy, but the money is going out in record volumes to defend Schultz in a tax case, and Bo Weinberg starts to get worried that it's going to absolutely, totally fucking ruin the rackets and ruin business for everybody. So what happens is Bo Weinberg goes to see New Jersey gangster Longies Willman, who in turn put him in contact with Lucky Luciano. Weinberg wanted to make a deal where he could actually retain control of the sort of the Schultz crime family, as it were, at that point, and a percentage if Schultz disappeared. So he says, I'll kill Schultz, I'll have him whacked, but I want to take over the rackets and I want to be in control, and you guys can have a percentage of this. Lucky Luciano instead, he didn't want to do that. Lucky Luciano realized that Dutch Schultz's life in crime was over with, that his sort of crime family was in disarray. Bo Weinberg was not strong enough to take on Lucky Luciano or anybody else for that matter at that point. So Luciano kind of steps in and just says, we're not going to do that. We're just going to divide the Schultz empire among the Italians. Or we will take the empire and we'll divide it between everybody, and that'll make more business sense. You can't have it all for yourself. But Luciano never was going to give anything to Bo Weinberg ever. So he sort of tongue-in-cheek lies to Bo Weinberg and says, we'll just spread it amongst everybody. I don't want one person to have it. We'll just spread it out. But the only way that would happen is if Dutch Schultz was killed or convicted of another in the next tax evasion trial. And Luciano believes Schultz, probably the likelihood would be that he would be convicted. And Luciano implements his plan. Schultz sort of catches wind that Bo Weinberg met with Lucky Luciano, and he wants a meeting with Lucky Luciano himself because he realizes he's about to lose everything that he's worked pretty much his entire youth for. He's going to lose all his fucking rackets. He really doesn't trust Luciano, but he's willing to go the distance to try to smooth things over. So he goes and sees Lucky Luciano to sort of clarify the situation. Schultz even converts from being a practicing Jew to becoming a Roman Catholic, and that was really an effort to just show Luciano that he was capable of change. He was willing to do whatever it took. And what happens is Luciano ends up bullshitting him. And Luciano just sort of tells Schultz, look, I'm not going after your rackets. I'm not trying to do anything. I'm just looking after everything, in case you end up going to prison. Somebody's got to look after you and kind of help you out. And that's all I'm trying to do. And that he tells Schultz, listen, if you go to jail, when you get out, you can have all your rackets back. You can absolutely have all your rackets back. It's not gonna be a problem. You can definitely have your rackets back. And that's sort of exactly what goes down. Temporary glitch there, but more or less, Luciano bullshits him by telling him, listen, you go to jail, I'm just trying to protect your rackets so that when you get out, you can definitely have them back. But Luciano has really no desire to help Schultz whatsoever. In fact, it's going to be a lot easier if Luciano can just sort of get rid of Schultz. But Luciano, he knew that Dutch Schultz wasn't a fucking moron. And he knew that unless something was done, there would likely be a war. He knew that Schultz wouldn't sit back. He knew that things were uneasy, and he knew he could only bullshit Schultz but so far and so much before Schultz overreacted or reacted in general. But because Bo Weinberg ends up going to Luciano, Schultz actually has him killed and dismembered for his betrayal. So at this point, effectively, Schultz is going to become a dead man, and he's going to become a dead man for a multiple amount of reasons, but there's one particular thing that gets Schultz killed. First of all, Luciano is going to take over his territory. It's just a matter of time. Dutch Schultz is under indictment for a lot of different things, but it's what happens next that ultimately is going to seal the deal for Dutch Schultz. And what ends up happening is Dutch Schultz ends up requesting a meeting in front of the mob commission. And what he does is he asks for permission to kill U.S. Attorney Thomas Dewey. Albert Anastasia, Jacob Shapiro, they both supported Schultz. They thought it was a good idea to kill a U.S. attorney. This guy's creating problems. Let's get rid of him. But every single other member of the commission absolutely said, no, this is a huge fucking mistake. What are you crazy asking for this? The amount of heat it's going to bring. We don't kill politicians, etc., etc. And Schultz loses his shit. He doesn't like the decision. He accused the entire commission of trying to steal his rackets from underneath of him. He accused them of trying to feed him to law enforcement. And Schultz ends up having a massive temper tantrum, is breaking furniture inside the room and left screaming, making threats. It is after he leaves that the commission agreed that Dutch Schultz has to die. And the guy who gets the order is Albert Anastasia. Albert Anastasia then sends Louis Buckhalter to kill Schultz. At 10:15 on October 23rd, 1935, Dutch Schultz was shot at the Palace Chop House, which was at 12 East Park Street in Newark, New Jersey. His two bodyguards were killed as well. Schultz really just got too big for his britches. The minute that he lost power and the minute that he was no longer able to control anybody else by fear, and his power base sort of dwindled, his own men were upset at him, Luciano realized he could take his rackets, but he didn't want to have a war to do it. So it was, let's let Schultz either go to jail, and then we'll take over, and then he can't do anything. But the minute that Schultz asked to kill a U.S. attorney, the commission says, no, that's it. This guy's way become too much of a problem. And he had to go. And that's what ends up happening when you get too big for your britches. However, Schultz didn't die, and I should have clarified this. Schultz didn't die as a reaction of being shot. He ended up getting sort of saved, and they send him to the hospital, and he goes into surgery. But the problem is Charles Workman, who is the one that fired the fatal bullet along with Mendy Weiss, coated the bullets with rust. And he did that because when rust-coated bullets, get into the bloodstream, they cause a massive infection, which pretty much poisons the bloodstream and will kill somebody. Dutch Schultz would linger for 22 hours before dying, but he might have survived. Had it just been a gunshot, that might have been one issue. But the fact that they were rust-covered bullets effectively was what killed Dutch Schultz in the end. And so as we look historically at Dutch Schultz and what he was able to achieve, one of the only non-Italians, other than Meyer Lansky and some others, that were able to infiltrate and control a racket in the days that the five families were being set up. From my knowledge, he wasn't even necessarily paying a tribute to the mob. He was considered maybe not so much an equal, but the mob didn't want to take him on at the time because he was strong, and he stayed out of sort of their areas for the most part. And he also contributed to their profitability by cutting them in on deals and stuff like that. But as we have seen historically, and this is the truth, is that you can only get so big for your britches. And Luciano was smart. He was smart enough to see what was in front of him, smart enough to realize a war would do nobody any good, but that either Schultz was going to go away for tax evasion, then they could take over his rackets, and nobody was going to fight them on that at that point. But Schultz makes the mistake of asking the commission to kill a U.S. attorney. Even though Albert Anastasia agreed that was probably a good idea, we all know that Albert Anastasia was a little bit of a fucking nutcase. But the rest of the mob said absolutely not. That would bring too much heat. I mean, for fuck's sakes, Dutch Schultz is already having problems being in the press because of this tax case. The last thing they want to do is hit a fucking attorney. And they realized at that point that the only way around it's just to kill him. And that's what they had done. And that's also just killing Arnold. If he had any involvement in the Arnold Rothstein hit, that would have been enough to get him killed back in those days. But the mob, works the way that it does. And when you become a loose cannon and make accusations against the commission, that's a pretty stupid fucking thing to do. And so Dutch Schultz, his rise was incredible, but his fall was epic. And you can draw parallels with a lot of history in the mob, especially when we talk about this. And it's always the same parallel. Guys get too big for their britches, say the wrong stuff. But what I don't think in this case had nothing to do with the fact they wanted his rackets. Because believe me, the mob had enough rackets. I mean, taking over his stuff is a couple million more a month maybe. But I don't think ultimately greed was the mitigating factor in the murder of Dutch Schultz. The mitigating factor was this fucking nut job wanted to kill an attorney. And he asked the commission for permission to do it. And there's just no fucking way. No racket is worth the amount of fucking heat that's going to come down on them. And you can even look at other parallels throughout history of the mob. So that's the story of Dutch Schultz. He was a crazy guy, insanely violent, was sort of a innovator in many ways of certain things. He was really like the first guy to come along and really fuck with the unions and control unions. But he got too big. And when you get too big for your britches and you mouth off the commission and make threats that they just want to take money from you and that's why they're doing this, he couldn't see reason. He was too upset, too self-obsessed with Thomas Dewey. And ultimately he paid for his fucking life with it. So that's the story of Dutch Schultz. Next week we're going to probably do a Q&A and maybe something a little more special. I got to figure it out. I wanted to thank everybody for being patient the last 2 weeks and sort of dealing with what I was dealing with and just being... I'm appreciative that people are busting my balls about it, but it is what it is. But I wanted to thank everybody for listening in, and probably on Monday or Tuesday, I'll put a Q&A thing out, and you can reach us on Twitter at RealMobTalk7, or just type in Mob Talk Radio, or you can go over to our blog, the... Mob Talk Radio True Crime blog. There's links on our Facebook page. Just type in Mob Talk Radio. You'll find us there. You can check me out on Facebook. I'm on Facebook as well, although I'm not taking a ton of friend requests, but here and there I'll accept a couple. Any questions, comments, complaints, or threats, you know where to send them. And that's it. I hope everybody has a really good New Year's Eve. It's going to be cold as fuck. Stay the hell away from Times Square. It's going to be fucking crazy cold. Sit in your house, pop a bottle of champagne, watch the shit on TV like the rest of the smart people. Don't go out there and freeze your ass off for nothing. Have a great new year, and we will see everybody next week.